Thank you so much, Kat, and thanks to the team for inviting me. I'm very grateful and honored to be here with you today as your keynote. So as Kat mentioned, I'm talking a little bit about radical re-envisioning. You'll see here that I have radical reimagining on the slide here. In the spirit of cultural humility, I'm still kind of deciding what I want to call this. So if you have any ideas at the end, I'm happy to hear them. So really quickly, just jot it down, or if you want to put it in the chat, you are more than welcome to do so. I would like you to very quickly think and name some of your personal, social, and professional identities that have been salient for you as faculty and practitioners in LIS. And then similarly, how have these identities shown up in what you teach and how you teach? So just give you a couple of seconds to think about that. And as you're thinking and chatting or jotting down some of these identities, I would challenge you to go beyond, sister, brother, partner, runner, or something of that nature. What are some of perhaps the invisible identities, or some of the identities that perhaps you don't typically discuss or even think about, but they could still very well have an impact on you as an educator, as you as a library professional. So the reason I asked you to start with this is that this is essentially your positionality. Specifically, this is your positionality as an educator. And so before becoming a faculty member, I'm actually finishing up my 11th year as a faculty member, which I don't know how that happened. But before that, I was reference and instruction at an academic library in my home state of New Jersey. And this is not something that I thought about, my positionality, specifically my educator positionality. So now as a faculty member in a graduate classroom for library and information science, I think about my positionality quite a bit. And positionality can be impacted by lots of things, your visible identities, your invisible identities, your education, your background. It could be really anything. The one that comes to mind for me immediately is geography. I happen to be in a very red state where the legislature is kind of anti-EDI on all things, right? So even something like that can very much impact who I am personally and my identities, personal, social, and professional, that I now bring to the classroom. All right. So we will swing back to this, but I just wanted you to get some of these juices flowing in terms of who you are as an educator. One of the reasons that I want folks to think about who they are as educators is this question that I have on the screen. Does the persona you espouse match the persona that you enact? All right, so in other words, do other people see you the way you want them to see you, or the way, perhaps even the way that you see yourself? I'll give you a quick example. One of my wonderful former students from the University of Illinois messaged me yesterday and said, I was in this meeting and I was with other collection development librarians, and she was really, really frustrated that folks who espouse to be allies and social justice advocates were expressing hesitancy and really maybe perhaps even a little disdain for certain books and certain materials that were about diversity, or perhaps a genre of diversity that they don't particularly prescribe to. So the most obvious example would be, we have lots of library professionals and just people in general, right? I'm not, in this case, not limiting to LIS, that have issues or different opinions or thoughts about the LGBTQIA plus community, and perhaps don't want to purchase those materials for their library. So this is the particular example that she was giving me yesterday. So in this particular instance, the colleagues that she was dealing with, and I should say I was very proud of her. She said she got in there and spoke up and, challenged their viewpoints and what they were saying. But in this particular instance, these folks that she worked with that said or espoused to be social justice advocates and allies did not match the personas that they were enacting. All right, so they were actually enacting the opposite of being an ally and a supporter. Okay, so think about, again, who you are as an educator, what your positionality is, and what you're bringing to your workplace, to your classrooms, and does it match what other people are actually seeing? So I have here, this is called the racism iceberg, but this could easily be the ableism iceberg. It could be the sexism iceberg. It could be, any ism, that we have that we think about, this iceberg analogy applies. Okay, so at the top, we have things that are seemingly socially unacceptable, right? So we have hate crimes, we have lynching, we have the KKK, we have burning of crosses, things of that nature. So on paper, these are things that we have generally as a society deemed racist and unacceptable and cannot happen. But unfortunately, as you know, a lot of these things actually do still happen quite a bit, okay? And on the bottom of the iceberg, we have, or under the line, if you will, we have covert racism. And these are the things that are still socially acceptable, and there's things that are still practiced. Now, depending on who you ask, a lot of these things are not socially acceptable. All right. So, I don't want to, erase the nuance of this conversation and of these things that appear here on the screen. But these are the things that are perhaps implicit, the things that these are the quiet parts that aren't always said out loud. But these are how we're socialized. And these are things that still come out in microaggressions and things that come out in other ways that can be very damaging to people and communities and workplaces. So for example, we have using people of color cultures as Halloween costumes. All right, that comes up every October. We still have racial profiling. We still have myths of meritocracy. For example, the model Asian myth. We still have color blindness. We still have people being accused of playing the race card. We have, like I mentioned, microaggressions. And so any of these things we could have, hours long conversations or additional workshops or talks, but these are the things that can keep us from making real progress. These are the things that, even if we're not necessarily cognizant of it, can keep us from being the people that we espouse to be. All right, because sometimes they just come out. And to be fair, a lot of times, folks do things purposely, but a lot of sometimes it's unconscious, right? So then we start talking about implicit and explicit bias, right? And these are the things that we need to be really proactive about to make sure that we're checking our environment and, making adjustments so we can eliminate some of the covert racism and covert isms that still exist in our organizations and in our profession. So when we're talking about the implicit and explicit, if you have not read On Being Included, Racism and Diversity in Institutional Life by Dr. Sarah Ahmed, I would highly recommend giving this a read. It's a very accessible read. And what I like about this particular title is that Dr. Ahmed gives us language for a lot of the things that we see, particularly in higher ed, and gives us language to talk about different things. So for example, she uses the phrase happy talk. And essentially is happy talk is when we are using the right words, we're using the buzzwords, we're using, the trendy words and the topics to talk about different dimensions of equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. So with the example that I gave you a slide or two back about the collection development librarians who were hesitant to purchase certain items and materials, they could have happy talk. They could have the right buzzwords in their speech. They could have the right buzzwords even in their collection development policies. They could say, oh, we're going to buy materials that represent our population, and they could talk about intersectionality. They could talk about all of the things, right? That's happy talk. So, to be colloquial, they are talking the talk, which is happy talk, but they are not necessarily walking the walk. Okay, so happy talk is just kind of a veneer, if we want to think about it that way. Dr. Ahmed also says that diversity is used as a policy mechanism to accommodate conflicting heterogeneity. All right, so diversity is often used as a band-aid to address differences and folks pushing back and rightfully pushing back against inequities and things of that nature. So again, uses this band-aid to say, oh, we're going to talk about EDI. We'll even have a committee. We might even have a conference on EDI and social justice, just to kind of make people think we're addressing it. But on a day-to-day basis, we're not going to change a thing. Okay. And along those lines, Dr. Ahmed also mentions diversity is commodification. And I see quite a bit of this, unfortunately. EDI and social justice are often trendy topics, and sometimes they'll go out of favor, for something else, and then they'll come back, et cetera. But when EDI and social justice are really popular, we see special journal issues, we have conferences with special themes, we have new books, we have articles and things of this nature. Right now, anti-racism is kind of floating, around EDI, SJ as well. And there is a scholar that I've been aware of for, I don't know, at least 2 decades, as long as, I've been in the profession, who has written 2 op-eds about anti-racism and is now proclaiming himself to be an expert in anti-racism. All right, so he is using anti-racism and diversity as commodification. And then finally, diversity as image management. And this is similar to the first 3 points. And this really refers to audit culture, right? So we have a lot of initiatives. Some of them are unfortunately going by the wayside now, where units and departments have to have a diversity statement. Perhaps they require diversity statements from job applicants or candidates. And this is used as image management to make it appear that they are walking the walk, right? So if someone were to come in and audit them, they could easily pass an audit based on a mission statement, a vision statement, strategic plan, policies, et cetera, that say the right things. But if this auditor were to stay in this department or in this unit for a week, for a month, for an entire semester or quarter, what would they say? What would they see, right? Would your image management trickle down to your day-to-day operation of your unit or department? And so she goes on to talk about paper diversity. This is the buzzwords in your paper documents and your policies. And she calls all of this institutional passing. All right, so this is certainly not to say that there aren't many departments and units who aren't walking the walk, but certainly there are many that don't, and that are just doing the bare minimum to kind of keep themselves in the mix and in compliance, I should say. All right, so a quick note about LIS demographics and leadership. I have a link to this at the end of the presentation. This is a book chapter that I wrote with Dr. Lucy Green, who is the director of the library school at the University of Iowa. And we're talking about inclusive leadership and how it is missing from LIS. And it's part of a larger collection of anti-racist LIS and community. So some of the things that we're talking about in the chapter are power, influence, oppression, and privilege. and how they manifest and how they do not in LIS leadership and in the profession writ large. So we need to be willing and able to recognize, identify, and name the mechanisms of systemic injustice. And this is, again, in our profession and certainly in larger society. And this is where I ask you, as professionals, are you willing to share or even give up some of your privilege so that others might experience some level of even temporary equity? All right. We have Patrick Stewart on the right here. This is probably made up, but I love the meme anyway. And he's just calling out. He's just being honest about what a lot of us know, that people won't listen to you and take you seriously unless you're a white male. Okay, so what does that say about our society and the inequities that we still deal with? What does it say about our profession? All right, so with all of this in mind, I'm asking you, you don't have to answer, it's just a rhetorical question. Are you ready to flip this status quo? Because this is what we have to do if we're even thinking about making changes in our profession and in our institutions. So when I say radical, and I'm talking about radical re-envisioning or radical reimagining, what does being radical mean? So often when we think about being radical, we think about something that's very extreme or perhaps even controversial, et cetera. But according to Dr. Angela Davis, radical simply means grasping things at the root. All right, it means asking questions. It means questioning the status quo. It means questioning the current dynamics and the power structures. So for those, I'm sure this group is very familiar with critical information literacy. And critical information literacy is where we start questioning the power dynamics, the power structures, and those types of barriers when we're talking about information and how we relate to it. So in that sense, it's very similar with radical as challenging us to ask questions and not just take what we're given, without thought or vetting. So this particular graphic mentions capitalism, white supremacy, ableism, patriarchy, et cetera. And of course, this is not by any stretch a comprehensive list, but instead of just accepting things and saying, this is how it's always been, I don't know what else we can do about it. We need to continue to question. We need to be proactive with our questioning and our rejection of the status quo. All right, so what happens if we're not radical? So these are two Black men that were arrested in a Starbucks in Philadelphia in 2018. And according to the reports, these two men who were waiting for other colleagues, they were going to have a little meeting in Starbucks. They weren't in Starbucks 60 seconds before the white manager called the police and said that they were trespassing. All right, so what happened here? The manager fell prey to their stereotypes and said that they felt threatened because the men were loitering and they hadn't ordered, and that they were afraid for their safety. So we've been hearing a little bit more of that narrative lately about people being fearful for their safety because Black people or people of color are in the vicinity. Okay, so this is what happens when we're not radical. So not only on the part of the manager, but of the folks that were in the Starbucks that didn't intervene and that didn't speak up. What happens when we're not radical? This is from a website called lismicroaggressions.com that was created by Cynthia Marie Orozco, who is a community college librarian in California. And what happens here is that people can submit anonymous quotes or experiences or, poetry, what have you. They were creating zines at a time to incorporate all of these submissions, but many of them are listed on the website, and I've pulled a few here. And I specifically pull from this website because I want to be crystal clear of how much this happens in our profession. So we have, lots of discussion about how we need to diversify the workforce. and we talk about retention, and we talk about all of these important things. And we have library workers of color and other library workers who are marginalized in different ways. Not only are they being microaggressed by patrons, they are being microaggressed by their coworkers. They are being marginalized and microaggressed internally. Okay, so I won't bother reading all of these. You can take a look. Some of them are egregious and words that we don't use. All right, but what I do want to mention is that these comments are still very common. All right, so what are we doing internally to shut this type of behavior and stereotyping down? What happens when we're not radical? This is a picture of the top supermarket in Buffalo, New York, where there was a mass shooting. And the shooter specifically said that he targeted Buffalo because of its high population of African Americans. All right, so this was specifically, very specifically, a hate crime, a very tragic one. All right, so we're not being radical. Why are we not asking questions about marginalized populations explicitly being hunted? So we're bringing some of these examples in this type of, I don't even know what the word is. We're bringing some of these things into our library space as examples, if you will. And so this is a branch library in the Prince George's County Memorial Library System that's in Maryland. And in June of 2022, they were having a series of events for Pride Month. And they came one day to discover this graffiti, and it says groomer. All right, so it's suggesting that the library workers and those who attend programs for Pride and et cetera are groomers and pedophiles, and a lot of these words and language that we're hearing a lot of. And this is specifically anti-LGBTQIA plus vandalism, and it's a hate crime. So what I also want to especially point out here is that the vandal in this particular case is a school librarian. All right, so we cannot say that we don't have these problems within the field and that, we are, so much better than everyone else. All right, so we have problems inside the house that we need to address before we can really tackle the problems outside the house. And the last example, what happens when we're not radical? I know that you're all familiar with the uptick in bans and challenges of books. And really, we need to pay even more attention to the narratives that are coming out around the books that are being banned and challenged. There is so much race-based and anti-LGBTQ-based disinformation coming out around these books. It's really damaging. So not that the bans and challenges aren't also damaging, but I think we also need to be paying attention to the narrative that people are hearing about how these books are obscene and pornographic, and they promote pedophilia and all of these things. All right, very damaging and quite racist. All right, so with those examples, just thinking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and this particular quote, "The ultimate measure of a person is not where one stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where one stands in times of challenge and controversy." So I think for me, a lot of what this boils down to is humanity. And when we see these very blatant instances of racism and homophobia and xenophobia, and again, all of the isms, I think it's a lack of humanity, that the people being targeted are not seen as human. So I don't know how we change that as a society, but it's something that we need to keep thinking about and keep working on it as much as we can. So just as a side note, on the left-hand side, this is a depiction of Ralph Yarl, who was shot and mercifully survived a shooting for ringing the doorbell on the wrong house. Okay. And on the right-hand side, we have a quote from Dr. Tutaleni Asino, who is a school librarian. He's a instructional technologist. And he said, "I am fully human when I recognize your humanity." All right. So I think when we're talking about re-envisioning, reimagining LIS and what our profession looks like, we start with humanity. All right, so how do we become and how do we stay radical? All right, because like a lot of other things, we can get there, but we need to work to stay there. So when I'm talking about radical reimagining, and again, this is not a comprehensive list, but these are the things that I study and the things that I work with in particular. We're talking about critical or radical self-reflection, and think back to, the opening exercise. Who are you as a person? Who are you as an educator? Then we talk a little bit about radical empathy, and I have a slide about that coming up, as I do about cultural competence and cultural humility. And these are just some of the components that I work with in talking about radical reimagining. So I'm looking more inward, who we are as people, who we are as a profession. And certainly once we get to this point, there could be even a second or third part to the radical reimagining where we actually reimagine our organization. Unfortunately, I think we are still a little far away from reimagining the profession, but certainly we should engage in some radical imagination about what we want our field to look like in the future. So very quickly, because I've written whole books about cultural competence and cultural humility, in a nutshell, these two concepts originally came from applied health sciences. So we have our counselors, our social workers, our nurses, our doctors, and these are front-facing service professions that routinely deal with communities and cultures that are different from themselves. So they've been talking about this for years, and we came a little bit late to the game, but we've been talking about this for quite some time as well. So in cultural competence, it is much, much more than cultural awareness. This is actually seeking out different perspectives and different cultures and actually celebrating them and incorporating them into a new status quo, if you will. Right. So I give other talks about decolonizing our syllabi, decolonizing our canon, of what we value, and thinking about the idea that we value and have been socialized to value, I should say, Western norms. So Christianity, whiteness, affluence, able-bodied, etc. And so where are the viewpoints and the perspectives of those who fall outside of Western norms? All right, so this is really where cultural competence comes in. We need to recognize that certain voices have been disadvantaged and even erased, and we're bringing them back and we're incorporating them, we're prioritizing them, we are valuing these other perspectives. Cultural humility is really this idea that we know that we can do better. Right. And we can do better in, wherever you want to place that thought. But specifically, we can do better in terms of our collections, our services, our interactions with our coworkers, how diverse our profession is, et cetera. And it's just this idea that we know we need to learn more. All right. So cultural competence and cultural humility, it's kind of the two are kind of like the chicken and egg, which came first, but they're very interdependent. So just to give credit, this particular graphic is from Project Ready. It was an IMLS, or it is an IMLS funded project out of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. The website is there on the screen. I would highly recommend checking it out. It's a complete curriculum. It's based for young adults, but I think anyone can learn quite a bit from this curriculum. All right, so very quickly, and I have an article that I have linked here, and it'll be in the presentation notes, other dimensions of radical re-envisioning and how it plays out in our workplaces, in our classrooms. So we have radical hospitality, that what we do as educators is not about us, but it's about our communities and our patrons, and how welcome they feel in our environment, and if they feel as though they're being recognized for their knowledge and their experiences. We have radical honesty, and this is suggesting that we need to bring our whole selves to the classroom. So as instructors, can we come with humility? Can we come with a little vulnerability and share, experiences with them? So for example, I tell my current students, what used to go well for me at the reference desk, what didn't go so well, right? And it just kind of hopefully levels that playing field a little bit and disrupts that power dynamic. So if they see that I can be radical and honest and vulnerable, hopefully that will encourage them to do the same. Similarly, we have radical love, which is talking about, again, just disrupting those silences and those power dynamics. And we have radical candor, which again is talking about bringing our whole selves to our students, our patrons, so they will hopefully be able to bring their whole selves to the experience. And then we have radical empathy. Just quoting, there's a great book called Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides by Terry Givens, would highly recommend. The 6 points that she makes, and I think that radical empathy very much is in line with the previous radical elements we just went over: willingness to be vulnerable, becoming grounded in who you are, and that relates back to our opening thought question about who we are as educators, our positionality. Opening yourself to the experiences of others. All right, so that goes back to cultural competence. We have practicing empathy. All right, and certainly practicing empathy, the way that that is labeled is a very broad concept, but how are we interacting with people on a daily basis? And not to overuse a particular cliche, but are we able to walk in others' shoes and try to imagine how they might feel and imagine what experiences they've had that could impact the current interaction? Okay. Number 5 is taking action, and again, that's being proactive. And number 6 is really talking about how we build and maintain relationships, not only with our colleagues, but with our community. So we need to build trust in order to create long-term and sustainable change. All right, so ultimately, being radical means taking some type of action, whether it's asking the right questions and then hopefully moving into tangible action. We often talk about this as social justice as well. So I'm going to give you a couple of my favorite definitions of social justice, and these are also on the presentation notes. This one comes from some of our colleagues in archives. And what I want to point out about this particular definition is that they explicitly mention the inequalities of power. All right, so the power dynamics, the different barriers, and they specifically say that these inequalities, or really inequities, manifest in institutional arrangements and systemic inequities that favor the interests of some groups at the expense of others. All right, so how do we disrupt those inequities? How do we disrupt those power advantages and really those advantages of privilege? And also what they mentioned, which I think is important, is that social justice is always a process. We will always be working towards social justice, because there will always, unfortunately, be some type of inequity that we need to be working to correct. So this second, very similar definition talks about taking action. All right, again, being proactive to change the status quo. And they talk about specifically destroying systematic marginalization and privilege. All right, so that's a pretty tall order, but it's something that, we can work towards collectively. And I always like to point out to people that even small actions matter, right? So if I do something, if Kat does something, if Ian does something, we can bring all of these things together for a larger cumulative change. The one thing I do want to point out about this definition, and this is just a kind of side note on language and how we think about things. This particular definition says that social justice is about giving voice to communities. And I would like to challenge that and say that we are not giving anyone anything. Folks that are marginalized or disenfranchised for whatever reason, they may have had their voices shut down or erased or suppressed, all right? But they have a voice, so we're not giving them anything. So instead of saying giving voice, we amplify their voices or we give their voices a platform, right? So just thinking about, how we talk about these different inequities as well. When we're doing this work, we do it on various levels. And the reason that I like to point this out is because this work can be overwhelming, right? And it's this idea, oh my God, I can't change the world. I can't change all of this systemic inequity. Certainly, we're not going to change it in a week or a month or a year, what have you. But again, this idea of working collectively and that small actions matter. And so we could be working on a micro level, which is perhaps what we're doing today with this keynote. And we're just, having some professional development, we're having some conversations and hopefully engaging in some level of critical self-reflection, for the sake of cultural humility and cultural competence. So that might be some micro work. Meso work, right? What are you doing at your organization, whether it's your library, your unit, department, or even your college or university? That would be some meso level work. And then macro work is what we're doing in the community at large. Okay. And so this micro, meso, and macro, all very fluid. All right. So there aren't really hard and fast lines. We could be doing micro and meso work today. Maybe next week you're doing a little macro work. There could be days where you do all three. There could be days when you do none, right? But just to kind of give some more structure to this idea of work that sometimes feels very amorphous and sometimes could feel like we're not actually making a difference, but we are indeed. All right, another note on language as we're doing this work. This is former Purdue University President Mitch Daniels, who called a Black scholar the rarest creature in America. So he faced a lot of backlash and ultimately apologized, but we need to be careful about how language further marginalizes people. All right, and so this is, again, specifically a higher ed comment. I'm sure that you all have heard things. I know that I've heard things. And again, we need to be cognizant of this type of language, and we need to get to the point where we can call out this language, because when this language persists, the systemic inequities will also persist. Similar example, this is a pop culture example from a show called America's Got Talent, where they have celebrities judging talent acts. This is Gabrielle Union, an actress who was a judge for a year and was ultimately fired from the show and then subsequently labeled difficult and angry and things of that nature. And so I suspect that we have all heard some of these things in our libraries, in our institutions. Think about the hiring process where you have, a candidate who doesn't fit, isn't the right fit for this culture. Or if you have colleagues of color, perhaps you are aware that maybe they've been called angry or difficult. So all of these words are coded, right? And again, they're coded and they perpetuate stereotypes. So again, we need to be careful about our language. Not only do we need to change our language, we need to call out the language that's still being used. All right, as I start to wind down, the librarian and educator that I'm going to give you some homework, if you will. And I want you all to engage in some radical reflection and planning. All right, so today is Friday. Happy weekend in advance. But what are you going to do next week? Monday, Tuesday, whenever, when you get back to work and you're hopefully still thinking about a point or two from this talk. How will you develop or improve your radical practice? All right, and that's as a library professional, as an educator, even as a person, if you want. We'll think back to, again, that initial exercise about the personal, professional, and institutional positionality that we have and how that manifests in our practice. What steps do you need to take to reach the place or places that you want to be? All right, if you decide that your practice is not radical enough, or perhaps you are engaging in some cultural humility and recognize that you need to learn about a particular demographic that your institution serves, because it could be a number of things. What steps do you need to take to reach that place? All right, so again, what can you do on Monday to start making these changes? And again, can be small changes. Additional questions for reflection, radical reflection and planning. These particular questions come from Mariam Kaba, who is an abolitionist, organizer, educator, and now a librarian. She says, what resources exist so I can educate myself? All right, so if you want to learn more about the trans community, if you want to learn more about the Muslim community, what resources already exist, right? None of this is about us recreating the wheel. It's just about being proactive and seeking out perspectives and experiences that we're not currently familiar with. So Kaba suggests finding ones that are created by people who are actually impacted by those experiences. So again, maybe find narratives that have been created by the trans community instead of folks who are writing about the trans community. She says, who's already working on this particular injustice, right? Learn about what work is currently being done so you can add to it. Do I have the capacity to offer and support, or excuse me, to offer support, right? So, and this is recognizing that we are also human and we also have humanity and we also have struggles. It's the end of the semester and, you know, everything that goes on in the world. Maybe you don't have the capacity to support someone at this particular moment, right? It doesn't mean that you can't help or learn about a community next week, next month, during the summer, next semester, et cetera. So it's that balance, right? And ultimately comes down to, we can't pour from an empty cup, right? So thinking about us and where we are in the process and how much work it takes to become radical, stay radical, become culturally competent and stay culturally competent. And the final question she's asking is, how can I be constructive? Right? So ultimately, we never want to do harm. We always want to work towards the good, right? We don't want to create trauma. We want to eliminate trauma, all of the different things, all of the different buzzwords and happy talk that we're hearing. But we do want to be constructive. We do want to be helpful. All right, so ending with this, unless there's a personal transformation, there can be no social transformation. So coming full circle, this idea that we need to know ourselves and we need to know who we are and our positionality, so we can better understand the diverse and marginalized populations that we work with. All right, so that is it. I thank you so much for being here today. This QR code leads to presentation notes with just about everything that I said here. The racism iceberg and different graphics are here as well. And I thank you for spending time and doing some critical self-reflection with me today.
Thank you, Nicole, or Dr. Cooke, I'm sorry. That was so great. I see that there is a question about the slides. Does there happen to be a link that could be popped into the chat?
Not that I have at the ready, but I can
All
certainly
right,
send it to you.
great. All right, so do folks have questions? Put your questions in the chat, or raise your hand if you would like to ask your question.
And it's a big topic. I know
It
it's a lot to think about. But while people are thinking, I will, I never ask people to do things that I don't do. And I have, if anyone is interested, I have written at least 2 articles or chapters where I have gone through this kind of critical self-reflection and have talked about how I got into equity, diversity, and social justice work kind of as an accident, and how I've tried to incorporate that into my pedagogy. And sometimes that works, sometimes it hasn't worked. And I've gone through semester long, academic year long kind of reflections on how to improve, how to change my pedagogy. So certainly I'm not doing it. I'm not asking you to do the hard work that I'm not doing myself.
So I have a question, and you discussed, I mean, you brought up some of this in the talk, and I feel like I definitely struggle with all of these things, primarily with like setting aside time to do that reflection piece. As a librarian and as an instructor, it just feels like so much of it is just go, go, go all the time. And setting aside any time for reflection is difficult. But I guess I'm just curious to know what are some of the biggest challenges that you see or that you experience as you're going about this work. Yeah. And how do you keep yourself from getting overwhelmed, quite honestly?
Let me start with the last part of the question. I don't. I get overwhelmed just like everybody else, all the time, in fact. I will, be honest, and, in a moment of vulnerability and transparency, this semester has been very difficult for me, for lots of reasons, and I cannot wait for it to be over. I've been napping a lot, right? It's my particular coping mechanism. And when the semester's over and grading is done, I'm going to take a week off and I'm not doing any work, even though I'm behind on certain things. So to say I'm equally overwhelmed, may not cope with things in the best way, but it's, what I know how to do. But, as I tell my students, I don't think that we should be setting ourselves up in that way to say we're not going to be overwhelmed, or to say that when we're doing this work that we won't get burnt out, right? I think that that's an unfair setup for anyone. And what I tell them is just to be prepared for it and to give into it, lean into it. And I think the key is not to dwell in it and not get back up, right? So if you're burned out, take your break, and then you devise a plan, perhaps with the radical questions or, what have you, about how you're going to get up and how you're going to do things better and or differently when you're able to get back up. So that's that part of the question. So I think, and I always want to acknowledge I am wholly familiar with the one-shot session, did it for many years. And it's difficult to do this work. It's difficult to do anything in 90 minutes. Let's put it there. But I think that this is where the self-reflection comes in. So if we are naturalizing or normalizing this idea that we are seeking out different perspectives and different voices, I think some of that comes out in our teaching and in our positionality. So when I was still working, when I was still practicing, I was the liaison to the education school or the College of Ed. And I, had different professors. I had one that came in and always wanted a session on young adult literature. So I would find, as I'm prepping for that session, who are the new authors? And I'm not necessarily saying that I'm reading everything, right? Because who has the time for that? But it's just kind of, did you know that there was this new young adult novel that talks about a young woman who has been bullied for wearing a hijab? Or, did you know that there was this new title, or that there's this new article, or that there's this new scholar that talks about XYZ? So in that sense, we can make a small change and it doesn't necessarily disrupt our content. And I want to be careful about this idea of disrupting content, because I have a lot of disciplinary faculty and even LIS faculty that say, well, I have X, Y, and Z to content that I need to cover, and I don't have time for this diversity stuff, right? And again, it's about these small changes. And I remember asking a faculty member who was, that does natural language processing. I said, so are you telling me that there are only white men that write in your area? And that kind of, took them back, which is what I intended. So, can you incorporate a different voice or perspective that's still about the same content, right? So I think part of this is looking more broadly about even some of the resources and perspectives that we include in our regularly scheduled programming, if you will. Kat, I hope that answers the first part of your question.
Does, and gives me some really great ideas and reminds me that I need to be doing this. That I need to be actively incorporating all of that into yes, I have an hour to do all of the things.
Yeah.
But it's not that hard, right? Like, yeah.
No. And and I think a lot of people in this audience in particular know that, with the one shot, I think, at least for me, I would always tell them, you're not going to remember anything I say to you in these 60 minutes, but hopefully you'll remember my name and where I live in the library, so when you need, that's part of that relationship building, right? And particularly if they can see themselves or hear different perspectives in your presentation or in your education, that goes towards the relationship building and enables them to feel like, maybe you're a trusted source or a trusted person.
Yes. All right. It does look like we had some great comments in the chat, and a question here. How do we engage in radical reflection when this reflection might be tied not only to our profession, but to other moral or ethical frameworks we've employed in the past, which themselves are being stressed and re-examined? In other words, how do we reflect when the very ground we stood on might be shifting under our feet? Where's the firm ground?
I think it's not a popular answer, but I think sometimes there isn't a firm ground. And I think we just have to ride the wave. The example that comes to mind immediately is grief, in the sense that grief sometimes comes in waves. Grief can be physical, grief can be mental, it can be this very amorphous thing. And I think that that's some of that critical self-reflection I think that's why it's hard, right? And, acknowledging the fact that some of the reflection we may do could actually be at odds with our institution or our department or, what have you. And I think we have to figure out where our lines are, where our boundaries are. It's just not going to be perfect, right? And to the person asking the question, I get it. I really do. I'm at odds with certain parts of my institution as well. And you just think about, and I guess what it comes down to, and this is what I tell my students, I'm not trying to get you all fired. I'm just trying to get you all to think bigger and think with more context. And figure out how to know yourself within whatever particular constraints that we may have. We all have them. So for example, the South Carolina legislature is coming after anyone who teaches in the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That doesn't change who I am as a person. It may have to change a little bit about how I teach. And by that, I mean, I may have to start calling things by different names, right? I may have to be a little subversive. I may have to not use work email when I'm communicating with certain people, right? So again, not trying to get you fired, but I think that there are ways that we maintain ourselves, even with a lot of those constraints that we have just no control over.
I really appreciated that compare or like bringing the idea of grieving or grief into it.
Because
That
I
I
think,
never thought of that.
yeah, I mean, if we are socialized, and I mean all of us are socialized, right? Um, and we are going through the process of unlearning, you know, there could be a certain amount of grief in that, particularly if you have a cultural background or a religious background or any of these things that we are kind of steeped in, and we have identified them as part of our identity, and we need to unlearn them or change them for whatever reason. That could be a grieving process. We grieve workplaces when we sometimes, you know, when we leave them. You could be grieving a particular way of doing things when we know, when we realize that we can do better and we have to do better. All right. So anytime we leave something behind, there very well may be some level of grief involved in that process.
Right. Does anyone want to ask one final question? Jenny Sipple says, I don't have a question, but a comment. Thank you for the work you do and for centering the importance of radical reflection and building relationships in library work. I am listening and your work matters to me and to the profession.
Thank
I'm
you.
so
Thank you.
grateful ARLD invited you today and that you accepted.
Yeah.
I read your work and center it in my own teaching. I assign your writing to my students and I honor your vulnerability as a speaker and scholar. Thank you. I think you definitely have some fans in.
Thank you. And I appreciate you all for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And Tim says, thank you. I appreciate the comparison with grief. I found the silences which come with grief some powerful moments of reflection.
Absolutely.
All right. And so with that, I think we are going to close the session and see all of you throughout the day today. The roundtables are up next, but also Dr. Cooke will be presenting on the colors of disinformation, information disorder, and the literacy landscape in session 2.
Yep.
We'll see you later too.
All righty. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.